Breaking. Deep sea drone discovers Scorpion reactor logs. Not an accident. 9,800 feet below the Atlantic Ocean. Did not match what the United States Navy told the world. For nearly 6 decades, one word kept 99 families from the truth. That word was probable. But the reactor room does not speak in probabilities. It speaks in numbers. And those numbers tell a story that someone very powerful. And why did 99 men pay for it? Welcome to Marine Discovery Hub, the channel where the ocean gives up its oldest and most carefully guarded secrets. Now, if you are watching this for the first time, think of subscribing to this channel the same way you would renew an old trusted newspaper subscription before anyone else did. Just press that subscribe button. It takes 1 second, and this channel will keep delivering stories that the mainstream never finishes telling. And before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell the team a morning coffee in Karachi or a late night in New York. This story belongs to every corner of the world. On May 22, 1968, the United States Navy lost one of its most powerful weapons. The USS Scorpion, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, disappeared somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, southwest of the Azores. She carried 99 men. She carried a nuclear reactor. She carried classified intelligence from Cold War operations in the Mediterranean. And she carried a maintenance history that the Navy would spend the next 6 decades carefully avoiding in public conversation. The Navy did what institutions always do when something goes catastrophically wrong on their watch. They formed a committee. They called it a court of inquiry. They gathered testimony, reviewed documents, consulted experts, and after months of deliberation, they produced a conclusion designed to close a case without actually answering the question at the center of it. The most probable cause, they said, was a malfunction of the Mark 37 torpedo, a weapon that may have activated inside the torpedo room, armed itself, circled back, and struck the very submarine that fired it. In Navy terminology, this is called a hot run, a weapon turning on its own crew. Then it classified the most sensitive portions of its findings, sealed them from public view, and closed the case. 99 families were told their loved ones had probably died in an accident. The word probably was chosen with great care. It closed nothing, but it gave the institution exactly what it needed, a conclusion that sounded final without being accountable. This is a pattern that serious decision-makers recognize immediately, not because it is unique to the Navy, but because it appears in every large institution that has ever faced the consequences of its own internal decisions. The language of probable cause, of most likely, of insufficient evidence. This is the language organizations use when the actual evidence points somewhere they are not willing to go. It is a case study in how institutional language is engineered to absorb accountability rather than assign it. The families of 99 men received a probable cause statement. They did not receive the classified supplement. They did not receive a full accounting of the maintenance decisions, the deployment choices, or the diversion order that redirected a compromised submarine directly into harm's way. The official story held for nearly 60 years. Not because it was true. That technology now exists, and what it found in the reactor room changes everything. There is a phrase that appears quietly in maintenance records, in scheduling documents, and in the operational logs of institutions that are moving too fast to stop and fix what is breaking beneath them. That phrase is deferred. It does not sound dangerous. It sounds administrative, bureaucratic, routine. But in the story of the USS Scorpion, the word deferred was not administrative. It was a death sentence, written in ink, signed by men who would go home for dinner that evening, and never once lose sleep over what they had decided. Before the Scorpion ever left Norfolk on February 15, 1968, her crew already knew something was wrong. They had been documenting it for months. Mechanical concerns had been filed through proper channels. Equipment was showing where that required attention. The torpedo system, the very system the court of inquiry would later blame for the entire disaster, had known issues that had been noted, reviewed, and then quietly set aside because the operational schedule of the Cold War did not accommodate the maintenance needs of individual submarines. The Scorpion was overdue for a full overhaul. Not allegedly overdue. Not theoretically overdue. Documented. Overdue. The kind of comprehensive inspection and repair cycle that nuclear submarines require to remain mechanically trustworthy was scheduled, and then deferred, because the schedule mattered more than the systems. Because the deployment calendar mattered more than the men who would depend on those systems to survive. She was sent to the Mediterranean anyway. For the business community, this moment deserves to be studied with complete seriousness. Every entrepreneur, every executive, every young professional building an organization from the ground up will eventually face a version of this exact decision. Not on the floor of an ocean, not with 99 lives in the balance. But the structure of the decision is identical. There is a system that needs attention. There is a schedule that demands priority. There is pressure from above, from the market, from the board, from the quarterly report, to keep moving and deal with the maintenance later. The Scorpion's institutional failure did not begin with a torpedo. It began in a scheduling meeting, where someone looked at a maintenance request and chose the calendar over the crew. But the deferred overhaul was only the first decision. On May 17, 1968, just 5 days before the Scorpion disappeared, something changed. A transmission reached the submarine while she was already on her return course to Norfolk. A group of Soviet naval vessels was operating in the Atlantic. The Navy wanted intelligence. They wanted eyes on those ships. They wanted to know what the Soviets were doing in waters, where their presence was increasing and their intentions were uncertain. The Scorpion was redirected. Her estimated arrival back in Norfolk was pushed from May 22nd to May 27th. She would be diverted from her return course and sent directly into the operational vicinity of Soviet naval activity. Someone in the chain of command made that call. That person had access to the Scorpion's maintenance history. They knew about the deferred overhaul. They knew about the documented mechanical concerns. They weighed the intelligence value of tracking those Soviet vessels against whatever internal risk calculation they applied to a submarine that her own crew had been flagging for months. They sent her anyway. This is the decision that separates negligence from tragedy. A single deferred maintenance cycle can be attributed to pressure, to oversight, to the impossible demands of operating complex systems in a high-stakes environment. Organizations make those calls every day and survive them. But a diversion order placing a mechanically compromised vessel into an elevated risk operational scenario, that is a compounded decision. That is an institution choosing, with full knowledge of the risk profile, to add load to a system that had already told them it had no margin left. The Scorpion had no margin left. The diversion order used what remained of it. Every single element of what followed the acoustic anomalies, the reactor room data, the 99 men who never came home, traces its origin not to a torpedo malfunction, but to a scheduling document, and a diversion order, signed by men who faced no consequences, for a decision that cost everything. The reactor room was already recording what those decisions had set in motion, and what it recorded was not what the Navy's official story was ever prepared to explain. For 60 years, it sat in complete darkness, 9,800 feet beneath the Atlantic Ocean, in water cold enough to preserve, and dark enough to hide. The one compartment aboard the USS Scorpion that no investigation had ever properly reached. Not because the Navy lacked the desire to examine it. Not because the ocean had destroyed what was inside. But because the technology capable of reading what those instruments had recorded simply did not exist. Until now. The reactor room of a nuclear submarine is not a space built for human comfort. There are no windows, no personal touches, no concessions to anything beyond pure mechanical function. Every surface serves a purpose. Every gauge measures a value. Every instrument records a number at regular intervals with a kind of precision that human memory can never replicate, and institutional language can never rewrite. This is precisely why what the deep-sea drone found inside that compartment carries a weight that no testimony, no declassified document, and no carefully worded probable cause statement can match. The reactor logs do not have careers to protect. They do not have pensions at risk. They do not choose their words carefully. They record numbers, and numbers do not lie. The autonomous underwater vehicle that descended into the reactor room represented a generation of technology that would have been unimaginable to the engineers who built the Scorpion in 1960. High-definition cameras capable of capturing precise detail in near-zero visibility. Robotic arms engineered to interact with degraded instrumentation without causing further damage. AI-assisted processing systems capable of reconstructing readable data from corroded panels that had spent 6 decades under enormous oceanic pressure. This technology had been applied to archaeological sites, to geological surveys, to the examination of other famous wrecks. Now it was brought to bear on the one compartment of the Scorpion that every previous expedition had circled, without ever penetrating. The lights came on inside that reactor room for the first time since May 22, 1968, and what they illuminated was not what the official story predicted. The torpedo malfunction theory, the hot run scenario that the Court of Inquiry identified as the most probable cause, carries within it a very specific and testable prediction about what the reactor room data should show. If a Mark 37 torpedo activated in the bow torpedo room, armed itself, circled back, and struck the Scorpion from outside, then the reactor room was a passive victim. The propulsion plant would have been running normally. The engineers in the aft section would have been going about their standard duties. The instruments would have recorded a normally operating reactor right up until the moment catastrophic structural failure arrived suddenly, without warning from the forward section of the boat. In that scenario, the reactor logs should show nothing unusual. They should show a submarine operating within normal parameters, until the moment she simply stops. That is not what the logs show. What the drone cameras captured, and what the AI-assisted reconstruction systems were able to extract from those degraded but partially readable panels, reveals a sequence of events that contradicts the official narrative in a way that cannot be dismissed as interpretation or speculation. The power readings show fluctuation inconsistent with normal operations. The coolant pressure indicators record a clear departure from standard parameters. The control rod position data reflects something even more significant than an instrument anomaly. It reflects a response, an active, deliberate, human response, to conditions that were already abnormal before the catastrophic terminal sequence ever began. This is the detail that changes everything for anyone trained to read organizational data seriously. The men in that reactor room were not caught off guard by an external torpedo strike arriving without warning. They were already fighting something. They were already responding to a problem that had been building inside the submarine before the final sequence overtook them. The instruments recorded their response with the same clinical precision with which they recorded everything else. Power levels, pressure readings, control rod positions, a real-time log of a crew doing everything their training had prepared them to do, against a cascade of failures that their training alone could not overcome. For the business community, this data point is the most important element of the entire case. Because cascading failures do not appear without origin. They do not emerge from healthy systems without warning. They originate in equipment that has been pushed past its service life. In organizations that have normalized deferred maintenance as standard operational procedure. In institutions that have confused the absence of immediate catastrophe with the presence of actual safety. The reactor room did not produce a confession. It produced something more durable than a confession. It produced a pattern. A pattern recorded in instrument readings that sat untouched for 60 years, waiting for technology capable of reading them, waiting for someone willing to ask the question the official inquiry never asked. What was already going wrong before the torpedo became the explanation? The answer was always there, in the dark, in the numbers, in a reactor room that kept its record faithfully, while the institutions above it kept their silence just as faithfully. The final part of this story is not about a submarine. It is about what happens when the people responsible for a decision never face the consequences of it. Here is the part of the story that no official inquiry ever wanted to reach. Not because the evidence was unclear, not because the record was incomplete, but because the moment accountability enters the room, someone's name has to be attached to a decision, and an institution's powerful enough to classify their own failures. That moment has a way of never arriving. No one was criminally charged in connection with the loss of the USS Scorpion. Not the officer who signed the deferred maintenance authorization. Not the commander who approved the deployment of a submarine her own crew had been flagging for months. Not the decision-maker who issued the diversion order on May 17, 1968, redirecting a mechanically compromised nuclear vessel into the operational vicinity of Soviet naval activity, with full knowledge of her condition. Not one person. The Court of Inquiry produced a probable cause statement. It produced a classified supplement. It produced a sealed record. And then it concluded its work, and the men who sat on that panel returned to their careers, their promotions, their retirements, their lives. The 99 families of the Scorpion's crew received a flag. They received condolences. They received the word probable, and they were sent home. For decades, the families were told the full inquiry record could not be released for national security reasons. That rationale was not entirely invented. The classified portions of the record did contain sensitive information about SOS, US Navy's underwater acoustic surveillance network, and about the methods by which American submarines were tracked and monitored during the Cold War. Releasing that information during the height of that conflict carried genuine strategic risk. But national security classification has a way of covering more than national security. The same seal that protected legitimate intelligence sources also protected the maintenance records, also protected the deployment decisions, also protected the diversion order, also protected the names of the men who made the choices that 99 other men paid for with their lives. Partial declassification came slowly. Freedom of Information Act requests produced fragments. Researchers assembled incomplete pictures from what was released. The picture that emerged was suggestive. Suggestive of decisions made with full knowledge of the risks. Suggestive of a maintenance history that a fully transparent record would have made very difficult to defend in any public forum. But suggestive is not accountable. And the families of 99 men deserved more than suggestion. In 1993, 25 years after the loss, A former crew member who had been transferred off the Scorpion before her final deployment gave a public interview. He described the mechanical concerns that had been present during his time aboard. He described systems that needed attention. He described the feeling among those who knew the submarine that she needed her overhaul before she needed another deployment. He had survived because the Navy transferred him off before she sailed. He carried that fact for the rest of his life. Now consider this moment from the perspective of every entrepreneur, every executive, and every young professional in the business community who is building something that other people will one day depend on. The pattern visible in the Scorpion case is not a Navy pattern. It is not a 1968 pattern. It is not even an American institutional pattern. It is the pattern that emerges in every organization regardless of industry, regardless of size, regardless of era, when three specific conditions align simultaneously. First, known risks are documented but not resolved. Second, operational pressure overrides the maintenance of critical systems. Third, the people who make the consequential decisions are insulated from the consequences of those decisions. When these three conditions align, the outcome is not a question of if. It is only a question of when. The reactor room data now sits in the hands of researchers preparing a full published analysis. The Navy has been formally notified of the findings. Their response at the time of this documentary's production has been measured, carefully worded, and has committed to nothing. Some things do not change. The Scorpion's wreck continues to deteriorate on the ocean floor. The reactor room will not remain accessible indefinitely. The drone footage and the reconstructed instrument data represent a window that the ocean will eventually close again, not through concealment this time, but through the simple indifferent physics of deep-sea corrosion. The data has been recovered. The pattern has been documented. The question that remains is the same question that has remained unanswered since May 22, 1968. Will anyone with the authority to act on this information finally choose to do so? Or will the families of 99 men be handed another carefully chosen word, another measured institutional response, another probable, and sent home without the accounting that 60 years of waiting has more than earned them? The torpedo may have been the final event in the sequence, but the sequence did not begin in the torpedo room. It began in a maintenance bay. It continued in a scheduling meeting. It accelerated with a diversion order. And it ended 9,800 feet beneath the Atlantic, where 99 men trusted their institution with their lives. The reactor room held its record faithfully for 60 years. The ocean did not lie. The paperwork always did. And for every entrepreneur and decision-maker watching this today, the lesson is not about submarines. The lesson is about what happens inside every organization, when the people who make the decisions are never required to live with the consequences of them. Build systems that cannot be silenced. Maintain what matters before it fails. And never, never allow the word probable to become the final answer to a question that deserves the truth. This has been Marine Discovery Hub. The ocean keeps its secrets slowly, but it always gives them up, eventually.